Well, welcome listeners to another edition of CAPS Conversations. CAPS Conversations is a new video podcast for the membership of the Christian Association of Psychological Studies. We hope that this series will prompt new considerations at the intersection of faith, science, and practice. And I'm happy to say that today also, this is a special new meeting. This is being hosted today by the Community of Counselors and Counselor Educators, which is a new division of CAPS. And my name is Dr. Kenyon Knapp. I'm the president of this new Community of Counselors and Counselor Educators division of CAPS. And we're trying to incorporate more counselors into the CAPS organization, and hope that you'll enjoy this. I should mention before I get into introducing our speakers today, that just recently, about a week ago, the CAPS Board of Directors decided that their conference this coming year is going to be virtual. It's not going to be face-to-face. I want to introduce our guests today. All our guests today, by the way, are professors here at Liberty University. And I should mention that I'm the Dean of the School of Behavioral Sciences here at Liberty University. Our first guest, you can see there, is Dr. Jerry Buncannon, who comes to us all the way from Singapore. And then Dr. April Crable, all the way from Arizona. And then Dr. Deborah Breboy from Arkansas. So glad to have you guys here today. But anyway, let's talk about telemental health now. Let's start out with something real broad, and we'll get into the nitty-gritty. But when you talk about telemental health, what are some of the best practices out there? Because if you're somebody like me, you know, you might get thrown into it, and you may be somewhat comfortable, or you only did WebEx, but not Zoom, and we're using Zoom right now, and all these different platforms. It can all be confusing, but I'm sure that you guys who've done it more know what best practices are for telemental health. So, but let's discuss a little bit. What are some best practices?
Well, I can jump right in. The first thing is kind of what you mentioned, is making sure that you become familiar with platforms, become familiar with laws and regulations of your state for telemental health, and just doing a lot of preparation, because it's a lot more than just turning on a computer screen or just calling your client and having a conversation. So that's really the first thing that I tend to tell everyone is research, research, research first before you just get started.
Right, and I'll just jump in there too. What April said about kind of preparing, one of the things we've done with the counselors at my practice is we practiced on Doxy and Zoom, so they were familiar with just how they worked, muting if something were to come up. We even do EMDR appointments through telehealth. So practicing with remote EMDR or active EMDR with each other just to see how the bilateral stimulation works. So just being familiar with what's available, and before you get a client in there and then, you know, you're not aware. So it's important to be a little bit prepared. And I would even add flexible. That's going to be important because internet goes down or service is spotty. And so preparing your client in the event for that to happen is best practice also. You know, if we lose connection, you can call back in, or if you lose connection, then let's just go to phone and finish our session out. So informing them ahead of time and having that covered is helpful also.
Yeah, and if I can even add to that, just not only in counselor preparation, but also client preparation, because technology proficiency is certainly important for telemental health work or any telehealth work in general. And some form of pre-consultation work or some time frame to get ahead just to be familiar with the process, because it's not only counselors have to be familiar with the platform, but also clients have to be prepared on their end as well.
Yeah. And I think that one of the biggest things too, just to go back just a little bit, is about the assessment of the client too, because not every client is appropriate for telemental health. And that's one of the things that in that preparation that Jerry and Deborah was talking about, is definitely sitting down, meeting with your client beforehand, gathering all of that information that we would do in every situation and figuring out, okay, are you actually um, do you meet the requirements? And that's just not just from diagnosis, but it's also whether or not they have access to, if you only do video, you only use video, then your client, of course, needs to have access to be able to do that. And so do they have great internet? Do they have a safe place to do this? Do they have, access to a phone? All of those things really is essential before you schedule that first telemental health appointment as well.
Yeah, and to go along with that too, I mean, I have some clients that we do their telehealth, they're in their car because they don't have privacy in their home. And especially when everybody was quarantining, there wasn't that privacy. So they would kind of like go somewhere and park in their car and do their session from there. And then some populations don't have smartphones, believe it or not, still. So they don't have the technology. And so they may have to do a phone session, but just like April said, assessing where your client's at. When COVID first started, we just transitioned current clients, but since that time, now we have new clients. And so just making sure they're a good fit for it. But along those lines too, it's been so beneficial for some clients who they didn't have to get a babysitter now. They could put their kids down for a nap and do their session. So they're saving driving time. So it's helping them not have to get a babysitter and not having to drive in. So it's working really well for a lot of different populations of clients. Some that live a little more rural, living in Arkansas. I have some that will drive in about an hour for an appointment. But this way, doing telehealth, they don't have to drive in now. And so it's saving them a couple of hours and they're not having to get out of their homes. And then also too, with COVID, it's eliminating kind of that exposure of being out of the house too. So it's kind of serving them with that too.
Well, it sounds like there's quite a few benefits there that you listed for the clients. And let's sort of flip that a little bit and look at what are some of the challenges too. I know there's a lot of benefits, but I think Jerry mentioned earlier that having basic computer literacy, it can be a challenge, because if you got somebody who's just a Luddite and they're not into tech at all, or they don't have a decent computer, or like you said, a good phone, that could obviously be a challenge. But what are some other challenges or things that could go wrong per se with telemental health?
I would add to, April alluded to it, just privacy.
Oh, yeah.
They've got to have some privacy so that the appointments are still confidential. And it's important as the counselor that you assess for that and help them brainstorm, like help them identify, like with some of our clients, like, can you get in your car and drive somewhere and have that privacy? Another challenge too, honestly, having done it now for all these months, is just internet, knowing what your resources are, but people will say, Doxy's gone down, or, challenges with Zoom or whatever. So, I mean, that can be a challenge too, if it crackles and you can't hear each other, and that can be frustrating. So sometimes that's a challenge also.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and just to touch on this as well, what Deborah mentioned earlier is the disruptions that can occur. And not only technology, but people in the home as well, and certainly to ensure confidentiality, but there are realities in people's lives. Sometimes they may not have a babysitter, maybe just a mother and her small daughter, and so she's having to take care of her little child. And so there's those interruptions, and that can even happen in brick and mortar settings as well. I've had clients bring in their child and have to manage that. So, but it's also creating that optimal atmosphere too, of that setting, to try to minimize that as much as possible. But yet also we have to be prepared only to deal with the reality of that, if that does occur as well.
And I found, so I maybe a little bit different than Deborah and Jerry. I don't know. I started this probably about 4 years ago. So I didn't have the, that push of you have to do this. So when I started, my biggest challenge, honestly, was getting clients on board and because many of them were like, I'm not sure about this. I don't know what this is. I need to be in the same room with you in order to get the same effect. And this is not traditional counseling. This is something different. And that was my biggest challenge. And I'm guessing, maybe post COVID, people won't have that. But I still feel like some people still are challenging that. Like what Deborah mentioned, that some of her clients just like, no, I'll see you after um, COVID, after this is over. And it was really literally me taking the time to sit, educate my clients, say, well, you know what, like next week, let's maybe try telehealth and then see if you like it, and then schedule the appointment for the following week face to face. And that was how I ended up being able to transition my clients over to telemental health, because it's one of those things that clients are just like us. They are afraid too of something new. So I had colleagues who were also like, I can't do that telemental health stuff. Nobody wants that. But I think the education piece, and it's the same thing that Deborah and Jerry mentioned, is what that's why it's so important for us to have researched this in order to present it to our clients so that they can understand it's just the same as if we were sitting in the office together with some technology and some new things we have to consider. But it's really about our approach with clients too.
Yeah. Now, talking about technology, I've heard all of you mention little bits and pieces of this throughout our conversation. Um, I heard Deborah mention DoxyMe, and you mentioned Zoom. Like, what are some of the platforms that are best practices to use? Because there's HIPAA laws involved, and you're trying to do confidentiality. Like, let's talk about the techie side of this. Like how do you, like, which platforms are best, or which emails are best, and all that? Anyone?
Well, I can jump in just a little bit. I use something different than what Deborah mentioned. I use Theranest,
Mhm.
but there's also Simple Practice. I mean, there's so many out there. The biggest thing is to make sure that you can get a platform that offers the Business Associates Agreement, the BAA agreement, to protect yourself and to protect your clients. But what is the most important is that you have to still inform your clients that nothing is 100% confidential. There's still that risk, and making sure that it's a part of your telemental health informed consent, to make sure that they understand that we cannot guarantee, even if we use our smartphones, you still cannot guarantee 100% confidentiality. So that's the most important piece. But of course, we have to do due diligence to protect our clients. And the way that we do that is look for platforms that says, yes, we meet HIPAA standards, and we want to do everything to take all those precautions to keep everything confidential, and they give you that signed agreement.
What about Deborah and Jerry? What are some thoughts you have about, like, which video uh, platform is best, or which email, or what other software stuff do you guys think is best?
Well, we use DoxyMe and Zoom primarily at our practice. They work pretty well most of the time. I think there are others that are tied in with your EMR system that you can use, so that's helpful if you need to use that. So I mean, it's just like April said, just kind of researching what will work and what will fit for you and your clients, and then just making sure that like for our clients with DoxyMe, they sign in and just kind of educating them, letting them know when they sign in, we're going to send them a link the day before their appointment. kind of confirming A, that they have an appointment with the counselor, and then B, here's the link for them to be able to access it. So even though they have the link from last week, we send it to them every week. Here's your link for your appointment, so that they can access it. And then we inform them the first time. We don't have to every time. They're going to log in, they're going to enter their first name and last initial. And, you know, for email, we use just an encrypted email service through our practice. So that keeps it HIPAA compliant and as confidential as, you know, it possibly can be. But I mean, it's just important to let clients know, you know, when there's, you know, any information being shared electronically, that you've done your research on the front end to make sure that it's HIPAA compliant.
And I don't think there's anything I can add to that, but I believe the key emphasis here is anything that's BAA appropriate, that has that. And as long as you have any platform that meets that, then you're meeting best practice with that element as well. Again, with the emphasis that nothing is 100% either.
And for listeners who aren't familiar, the BAA, Business Associate Agreement, is part of HIPAA compliance, right?
Yes, it is, and it's what you and the company who owns the platform that you're using signs between you and them, basically. I also want to jump just to add a little bit, because I know people are always thinking about cost. So when you think about one of those challenges you mentioned, it depends on how large your practice is, or even how small your practice is, whether or not you can afford a lot of these platforms and the electronic health records, because those things get costly, and sometimes they charge you by the amount of clients you have. Sometimes they charge you about the amount of counselors you have. So it's important to do that research too. And because sometimes people can't afford to even use some of these platforms. And I think that's where some of them get into that ethical dilemma piece about, well, I want to use this, but it costs more if I don't use the free version of it. And so just being aware of that risk as well. And if it's, you know, you have to, is an investment. I mean, just like electronic health records, and you're talking about email. I don't email clients at all. I email them or communicate them only through Theranos, which my electronic health records is there. I do billing through there. I do my telemental health sessions through that, and I chat with clients through that only. So it's just different things, and there's so many out there now. So it's important to research and not just jump on one, because then, like Deborah and Jerry mentioned, it's about what meets your practice needs, and that's where you want to start.
Right. And like April talked about, most of those have a free version, which is bare bones basic. And then they have an upgraded version that you can pay for, and usually a couple different levels of that. So, you know, now at our practice, several of us do provide EMDR counseling. And so we also use, there's a couple that are available, probably more than a couple. I'm aware of a couple: active EMDR and remote EMDR. I think one of them is free, the other one you pay for. And so like April said, there's these costs, and they do start to kind of add up, you know, monthly costs to use them. It's just cost of doing business. We call it CODB, cost of doing business. So, you know, yeah, but to provide best services to your clients, and if you're doing telehealth and you're doing EMDR, then you've got to be able to find a way. But just being aware of the cost, being aware of how the technology works, making sure that you can have a BAA signed with each of them, making sure they're HIPAA compliant. Like that takes a lot of preparation work on the front end before you even sit down and meet with clients. And I would also encourage you to just consult with people that are providing telehealth services and kind of find out, what do they do? What are pitfalls for them? What are obstacles that they've seen? Because that will help you a lot also. make some of the decisions you have to make.
That's a great segue into what we talked about earlier a little bit. You talk about the cost of doing business of this, and there are costs with each one of these software packages and all that. Let's talk about insurance for a second. How are the insurance companies about telemental health? Are they weird about it, or do they pay you the same rate, or is it different, or how does that all work?
So yeah, my practice bills insurance.
Okay.
And so when COVID hit, there were some that paid for telehealth services prior to, some. Since COVID hit, there are others, most of the others, I will say, have now paid for telehealth services. In fact, they've made it, what we've called it, they've incentivized their people to use telehealth rather than face-to-face, because that keeps them from being out in the public, from going into places, being exposed. So they've also paid for their copays and deductibles. So it's really been a huge benefit to clients, especially those that hadn't met their deductible, back in March, April, May. So now their deductibles being paid for them if they use telehealth versus coming in doing face-to-face. So it's been a huge, just, positive for them to go ahead and use that. So, and right now it's extended through the end of the year. They change it. That date has changed multiple times, and we're still wondering where it's going to land. And we're just really hoping that after the first of the year that they still see the benefit in telehealth, like for those that may live rural, or those that have children, or for whatever reason. And so they may still, but the reimbursement rate is the same as it is if it's a face-to-face. I mean, the number, it doesn't change. There's no discounted rate for it to be telehealth. So we'll see where it goes afterwards. I know, talking before, some folks doing telehealth, they only do self-pay and cash rates. And so it's important too to realize, one of the things we haven't talked about yet is, you have to be licensed in this state. So most of the counselors in my practice are licensed in Arkansas, and we practice in Arkansas, and we have Arkansas clients, and they're in Arkansas when the services are provided. So you have to be aware of that. You've got to know where the client is and make sure you're licensed in the state that they're in. So we live right on the border between Arkansas and Oklahoma. I'm also licensed in Oklahoma. So my clients, some of our counselors in our practice, like their clients in Oklahoma have to drive into Arkansas for them to provide telehealth services. Like they can't be at home because it's across the state line. So you have to be aware when you're providing telehealth, where is the client located when that service is provided also.
That's a great point. You're making me think of a lot of things. Some people who are, say, a little critical of telemental health, they might say, well, hey, what about like if there's a dangerous client and there's a duty to warn situation, and you're in Arkansas, and then this client, they're in Texas, and they're saying, oh, I'm going to go kill my loved one or something like that. How do y'all account for duty to warn situations, for someone who's skeptical of all this?
So I can jump in. So I'm licensed in 4 states, and it goes back to that preparation.
Okay.
So the preparation is knowing what those duty to warn laws are in the state. Also, I have to do research on every client about what's the local sheriff's department, all of those emergency services, what the laws are for that, what's the numbers for those. So it's a lot of work goes into every time I get a new client, because I have to figure out what is the closest. I'm not going to call 911, and it is too many steps. If I call 911 from where I am to try to get someone that's in Texas and I'm in Arizona right now, right? But if I know the local departments that's near where they live, or maybe where they do, if they always doing their session at work, then I'm doing all of that prep work ahead of time. I'm also thinking about, let's make some building relationships with other counselors in the area, because sometimes your client may need to see someone face to face for a little while because something has happened and they want that, or you have deemed that they're not appropriate for telehealth. And so it's better to build relationships with other people that you can refer your clients to, so it can be a nice, soft, warm handoff versus just saying, oh, let me just refer you to 5 people I've never even heard of before. So it's that whole preparation, and sometimes it's literally a lot more work than just showing up to an office where your clients are going to come see you.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So, I mean, once you've been doing it a while, I don't get new clients coming in too often because I have a pretty established caseload. Because when you do, then really it's a whole matter of doing all of that homework. And you know, if you're just starting a practice, that's a whole lot of behind the scenes work to do for each one of them. But you also have to just kind of remember, you know, I'm not going to have somebody going rogue in Texas. I'm not licensed in Texas, so I'm not going to be taking on clients that reside in Texas. So you've got to be really aware when clients call in and educating them. A lot of people think when you're doing telehealth, like anybody can call from, you know, they can put up a thing on Facebook, I'm doing telehealth now. And I know there's some platforms out there where I think there's some misconceptions, you know, I won't name any of them. I don't know that they're promoting misconceptions per se, but I just think the general public doesn't really understand, you know, you've got to be licensed in the state where you are and the state where the client is at the time of the service. So just knowing that ahead of time, if somebody called and said, well, hey, we want to know about doing telehealth, we live in Wisconsin and we're not licensed in Wisconsin. So I can refer you and try to help you find a provider in that area. But, you know, and I think that's important to just know ahead of time.
And it's and just to make sure, because sometimes people also get confused, it's the actual physical location of your client, not the state that they reside in. It's actually where they are at the time of service. Because like Deborah, you mentioned, a lot of people get confused with that. But even if my client has a house and live in Arizona, but if they're in Arkansas just on vacation or on a work trip, I still can't see them because I'm not licensed in Arkansas. And that's really a big ethical and legal violation to do that.
Right. And that goes along with what April mentioned earlier too, is doing the homework ahead of time and knowing what, you know, if I got licensed in Florida and I saw some clients who were on vacation in Florida, and then you've got to know the duty to warn and report laws for each of the states that you're going to be providing services to clients that are there. So that you've got to know ahead of time too. But like she said, it's not where the client resides, but where they are when the service is provided.
And this probably goes without saying, but it's certainly educating the client and making them very aware that there are limitations. So should a client want to continue receiving services, should they choose to move or go on vacation and such. But I've had those situations where clients wanted to still have services, but they were going to be out of state at the time. And that's just not appropriate, of course. And so again, it's just making sure that it's clear up front as part of, you know, your intake and making them fully understand that as well.
And some states require you to ask your client every time where are they located, and you have to put that in your notes as well. So there's really no excuse not to know where they are, because it's required mostly in every state for you to ask.
Right, and that's got to be documented in your notes. So client counselor provided service in their home office in this city in this state, and client was located in the city in the state, and it's got to be documented.
It almost sounds like your case notes need to be a different format of case notes than traditional, like SOAP notes or something like that. If you just have like a spot there for each session, like where they
Right.
are and things like that.
It just requires that one extra kind of sentence. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I want to build a big doctrine out of that one thing.
Right. Right.
We're not as familiar with it. Let me ask you this too. Y'all have been doing this with clients for a while. What are the clients saying about telemental health? Like how do they experience it versus traditional? What's the feedback y'all get?
Well, like April said too, I mean, I've been providing telehealth for about 4 years, and I had clients initially when I started, I had a lot of high school students that were graduating and going to college within the state. And so it provided that continuity of care, which is really helpful. Here they're going to a new environment, and they didn't have to change counselors if they had some anxiety or depressive symptoms or eating disorder or whatever. Those seem to be the ones I worked with the most. Mm-hmm. So it provided that continuity of care, and they loved it. They loved just having that time where they could kind of have that familiarity. During this time of kind of COVID, I've had a lot of clients that have seen a lot of the benefits and like it so much that when I do resume face-to-face, they want to continue doing telehealth. So it's been a benefit for them.
Okay. That's great. Well, let me ask you all this too. Well, let's just say one of the listeners today is going, man, this is so interesting. I love it. I want to do this, whatever. Are there any like resources that you would recommend for people to get additional training? Like, I don't know, books or videos, or are there any like clubs online where people like support groups or things like that? You know what I'm saying? Like people who want to learn more about this?
Yeah. So there are now I think there are so many places that have training. We have a training that's I think pretty great. There's also you can get a certification here. So you have to do so many hours to get certified, take an exam for that. The behavioral health, telemental health certification, which you can do through MBCC now, I think. And so that's one of the things, everywhere you go, there are lots of information, books, manual. I put a little handbook out for counselors who are just starting with telemental health as well. But I think there's so many things now that before there weren't a lot of information. There's a lot of research studies that people have done more than before. They're showing how effective it is, because I think that's also was one of the things that I would run into, that people was like, oh, that's not really effective at all, but it's showing that it's just as effective as same room sessions. And so I think that there's several, I don't know, Deborah and Jerry, if you all have some other things to put in there, but I think that's one of the benefits now, and especially with COVID, one great thing that came out of COVID for our field is that push of telemental health. People are getting educated, people are doing it, people are talking to each other. But there's also a major group on Facebook, and I can't think of the name of it right now, but it's a telemental health for counselors is a group on Facebook that's but I can probably get the name to you later. But yeah, there's plenty of resources now.
Well,
yeah, and I've used that one a lot too. When I've had people reach out to me that are the most recent one, somebody was in Pennsylvania, and a couple weeks ago I had somebody from New Jersey, and so I can kind of message on that Facebook group who provides telehealth services in these states, and I get several names. I can pass that on to the potential client. So those resources are really helpful. But yeah, there are a lot more resources, and it is nice that it is one of the perks of the COVID is that people are seeing the benefit of it and becoming familiar with it. It's not so, techie new age, and, they're using it too with their medical doctors some. And so it's something that's, I think, here to stay now, and they're seeing the benefits of it.
Yeah, and just to add to that, to emphasize, I think what April started off with and what we've all shared is research and find out what your state requires as far as telemental health certifications, because some states don't have that in place as far as codified by law. Others do. Some require, I think, Deborah, your state, Arkansas, requires a specific training that they can't get anywhere outside the state. It's only authorized certain elements, and you can speak further to that, but some states require so many hours, but you have to have just a general telemental health training. You have to go through a specific training, maybe authorized by the state, while other states just don't have anything at all. But of course that's trending, and you find out what's required as far as not only the number of hours, but what topics have to be covered, as well as renewal processes as well, just like licensure renewal, like how often you have to be recertified in telemental health work as well.
Well, this is all really interesting, and I think our listeners are getting a broad overview of the whole topic, and as well as a number of specifics, which is really good. Let me ask you this too. I've gone over a number of questions, but invariably I skipped over something, and you all had something in the back of your mind you wanted to say today that I didn't even get to. So when you think about telemental health, are there any other words of wisdom per se that you'd want to share with the listeners?
I think just maybe to end with client feedback that I received. So I had a client who reported that she really appreciates telemental health because, one, after sessions are really hard. And instead of her having to get in the car and find the strength to drive herself home, go through traffic, all of those things, that what she found was that she felt a lot safer after sessions. She was able to go with her spouse and just get that hug that she may have needed after a session, or being able to just sit and relax and not have to have that, use that self-talk to get herself even home, and or maybe not wanting to cry in the car, or any of those things, that she could able to just walk away from the computer and be in a safe place. And it really hit to me when she said that, because there was something before I started doing telemental health that I didn't really think a whole lot about. Like, yeah, we want to get clients to a place where they're not, that they, back to some sort of normalcy when they leave the office. But honestly, when they left, it's like, okay, well, I got to get to my next client. You know what I mean? But not really you think about how they get themselves there. But sometimes I didn't think about how they left the office. And when she shared that with me, it was a aha moment. Like, this is really providing them a kind of a safe place when they leave.
That makes a lot of sense. What about Deborah or Jerry? Do you have any some final thoughts on just general feedback to the listeners about telemental health or anything?
Well, one thing that comes to mind is considerations you make for in-person services you would also make for online, like appropriate setting, your office, so to speak. Looking at Deborah, she's got a wide shot, a nice, neat office, and everything orderly and in place. And you certainly wouldn't want all of that all over the floor. The books all over the place, or disheveled office or anything. And certainly your own presentation as well, and everything that you would do in person, all the appropriate paperwork, intake, informed consent, assessments that you might utilize would be similar, but of course you would have to have any specific telemental health language as it relates to the limitations related to this work as well. So A lot of the same practices that you would do in person, you would do online, but again, it's just another layer as well.
Yeah, I agree with that too. Yeah, just being mindful to, you know, professionalism, the paperwork. A lot of times too, if I've got some things I'm going to have a client do, I'll send them a link ahead of time. Whereas when they come into the office, I would just give that to them. But just being mindful, sometimes you have to just be a little bit more prepared when you're doing telehealth. And then I just would want to just kind of remind, we talked about it earlier, just being flexible though, because different things work for different people, and just being mindful of that.
Absolutely. Well, I should let the listeners know that all of our guests today, Dr. Crable, Raboy, and Buncannon, they were part of a telemental health training committee here at Liberty, and we did a more extensive training. And if any of y'all want to see that, feel free to email me here at Liberty. My email is kcknapp@liberty.edu, and I'll be glad to send that to anyone who requests that. And that'll definitely, hopefully, be helpful to the listeners. Thank you all for your time today. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate you sharing from your life experience and all the different things you've been through to get to this point to be able to share about this. I know there's so many people out there who are just still struggling to adapt to it all, but I think this is definitely getting them headed in the right direction. So I appreciate that. With that, we'll wrap it up. And we thank all you listeners for joining us today in this CAPS Conversations. And we'll be back with you again next time. Thank you so much.